This video is going to break down my Cyberpunk 2077 weapon redesign. I chose this design because it had a good contrast between realistic and sci-fi elements. I've also added timestamps in the description since the length of the video is pretty long, so if there's anything specific you want to see, please check down there. To start, I'm going to play the gunshot without any of the backgrounds turned on or any of the effects buses, and then I'm going to dive into each component of the gunshot. To start the breakdown, here's the transient layer. Now here's the first layer. Here's the second layer. When it comes to sounds that are meant to be impactful, I like to have double hits or double transients, just because I think it's going to help when the mix gets a bit busier later on and these sounds are put into a different context. Now I'm going to show how I did the processing for the first transient layer with the plugins on and bypassed. Here's with processing, and now without the processing. To be honest, after listening back to this, the transient designers here aren't really doing anything and the clipper is just used as a safety. So now let's have a look at the second layer with the processing chain on. As you can hear in this layer of the transient, it has a lot more noise and I thought that fit conceptually well with an energy-based weapon. So let's hear it now with the processing off. So the way I'm using the transient shaper here is more like an envelope rather than just for the attack. A lot of the sounds in the second layer have a bit more information towards the end of it, so I didn't want to have to go and edit each tail individually. And then at the end of this chain, there's a clipper, and I don't really believe it's doing much, if not anything, and it's just there as a safety. And then here's the mix bus for the transient. Let me play it without. On the mix bus of the transients, I'm using a high pass EQ because I wanted to take out all the low end information or all the low mid information, because this is occurring at the same time as my sub layer, and I didn't want anything to compete. Here are the layers that are used in the body of the sound. I just want to say too that both of these sections are going to be a little different because I did automation afterwards to create scene changes. But let's look at the first layer. Now with the processing off. Now with the processing. So if we take a look at the processing, you'll see that I'm using R-Base. And it's not necessarily because I wanted 60 hertz or 40 or 80 or whatever. What I'm doing here is I'm sort of trying to boost the sound harmonically and then sculpt out that area. I find that this really helps, especially when you're trying to push into compressors or distortion or something. Sometimes using R-Base and then sculpting it away helps you get a fuller sound or helps you push certain aspects of the sound that you might have wanted. And then let's see what the clipper is doing. So all this is doing is just taming some of those peaks. And now let's take a look at the second layer. Now here's the second layer with the effects off. As you can hear, each impact is a bit different, and what I'm trying to use EQ for is to bring some sort of cohesion to the timbre. So now let's play both sounds together. The next layer we're going to look at is the style layer, but I think some of the elements in both the body and style are interchangeable. So the first layer I'm going to go over here is some electrical source that I created, and I'll show this a little bit later on. Let's have a listen. So I decided to add an electricity layer here because in the reload of the gun, you see a little bit of a spark, and so I want to keep continuity between each section of the gun. And then for context, yeah, you can kind of see this little bolt of electricity in the back here once the clip is pulled out. And then here's what everything sounds like without the processing. Now let's look at how I process the sound. All I'm trying to do here with the tremolo is give it some movement, and then the ring mod's going to add some grit. And then Sooth 2 is cleaning up some of the harshness that was brought on by the ring mod. And then I'm using Radiator for its saturation. And then at the end here, Pro L2 is just being used as a safety. And then after that, what I'm doing is I'm using EQ to take out some of the lows. So let's hear what it sounds like with and without. Here's what the second layer sounds like. From what I can hear, it has a lot of mud, and I wanted to clear some of this out so I could start processing on top of that. So here I'm using OTT to see if there's any interesting artifacts that live in the high end that I can kind of pull out. And then I'm going to use L2 to slam it to get more of the body out of it. And then I'll use another layer of L2 to sort of slam it again so I can really pin the sound and then use it as a place to sculpt from. What you'll see me do here with Serum 2 is use the multiband because I think it's similar to the one that's in Ableton. And I'm really just using it to sort of tame each part of the frequency spectrum, specifically the low end, so I can kind of contain some of that from overloading other parts of the sound. So inside of Snap Peep, I'm using ring modulation, so that way I can give the sound a bit more character. After that, I'm using Devil Lock to flatten the signal a bit, and then I'm using Pro MB to contain the low end. And then after this, more EQ. And then with Recenter, I'm trying to fix some of the stereo image. And then at the end, L2 is being used to contain the sound. Now here's the third layer. This specific layer was constructed to sort of represent how the bullet or the projectile is moving outside of the gun. So here I'm using OTT at 100% to see what kind of character I can pull out of the sound. Then I'm using Pro Q4 to cut out some of the low end, and I'm using Pro L2 to turn up the signal. Up next is the Servo Layer, and I'm using this as a sort of noise layer that will help add some dirt and grit to the sound. It's called Servo because this layer is derived from the mechanical parts of the gun moving in a later part of the design. So you can hear what I mean. Here's everything without the processing. Like I mentioned earlier, this is using a sound that's derived from another piece of the gun. In this case, it's the mechanical bits that are opening and closing within the gun. And I thought it helped kind of bring continuity between both the shot and the movement. It also has a lot of noise to begin with, so it kind of seemed like a no-brainer to use this again. I used Ensemble because I wanted to smear the sound and also spread it out a bit. L2 is here to just turn up the signal. I like to use Absinthe to process sounds and see if I can get any cool timbral changes or get grit or some sort of dirt out of the wave shaping ring modulation. And then here I'm using Snap Peep's ring modulation for a similar purpose. And as you can hear, it's added more grit, so it'll help it stand out a bit more in the mix. Listening back, I think this wave shaping is actually getting rid of some of that grit, but it's helping smear it into a layer that I thought was, I guess, a bit more usable. Just to hear what it's doing with the ring mod. And here's without. To me, adding the ring modulation before the wave shaping helped it sound a bit more aggressive. And then at the very end here is just L2 to catch some of the peaks. So now I'm going to look at the Mech Layer. This Mech Layer is trying to represent the two pillars that are at the back of the gun here that every time it's fired kind of push out. I don't have the original session that created these mechanical layers, but what it is just a normal reload from any sort of gun, and I thought it sounded sort of anemic, so what I did was I used R-Bass, I EQ'd it, pushed it into Devil Lock, and I tried bringing out some of the body and squishing it, because I don't need the top end and I don't need any low end. I just need the character that sort of sits in the mid-range. So to start, I like to use Crystallizer to widen out the sound and sometimes change the pitch and then layer that in with the dry signal. But here I'm using it to sort of act as like an echo. After that, I'm using Recenter to sort of fix the stereo image into a place that I want it to be. Using Pro Q4 to clear out some of the mud in the low end. And then I'm throwing it through Pro MB to kind of boost up the tail as the sound decays. And then the next Pro MB that I'm throwing on, all that's doing is sort of taming the mid-range and kind of flattening it out. And then Pro L2's at the end, and it's mainly just a safety. So I have Crystallizer, like I mentioned, on the tail mix bus. And then after that, I'm sending it through Soothe to sort of tame some more of the signal and once again flatten it and even the sound out. And then to wrap up the final layer for the gunshot, I'm just using a kick drum. I really wanted the fundamental of this kick drum to hit in a certain frequency range. In this case, it happened to be 60 Hertz. Hypothetically, if I was going to have more explosions and things, I would sort of limit the frequency bands just so I could have different ranges to add excitement later on. And at the end of the chain here is K-Clip and Pro L2, but they're not really doing that much. They're just there as a safety. One thing that I wanted to do at the end of this design was create some sort of scene change, especially since this is a linear design. And what I did was when the gun kind of zooms in, I boosted up the kick, as you can see here on the volume, and it ends up distorting, but you don't hear it in the mix. So yeah, in the mix, I thought it sounded pretty good and it helped create a different scene change for this design. This next part of the design is for when the character decides to aim down sights. So this is also a consolidated file from an earlier project session. And I think what happened here was I used a sample from like Soundmorph, probably some sort of mechanical library sample, and I used a pitch adjustment. All I did was add an extra layer of a kick drum, that way I could sort of solidify that the player has aimed down sights and is now locked in. And now that final sound just represents the character zooming out. Here's what the charge sounds like. The first layer is just some metallic kit, and all this does is reassure the player that they've activated the charge and are holding down the button. So this next part of the charge is a layer that you heard earlier that was in the shot, and it basically represents movement. I kept it in the charge as well because I want to keep continuity between the parts and also sort of tell a story of this energy traveling through the gun. So the third layer here is a charge sound that I made in Serum, and I'll show this patch a bit later, but let's have a quick listen. So a lot of what's happening here is me making adjustments to the patch that I made in Serum. I added R-Base and Recenter and just a lot of plugins to help sculpt it. But what's occurring in the patch is that as this build starts to swell, I'm filtering out the low end. So a lot of this adjustment with R-Base is really just there for the initial part of the sound that has the low end. And then once it gets filtered out, we now have room for the shot. So now we're going to listen to both of these layers put together, and I think combined they make the charge sound a bit more interesting. This next layer is supposed to represent all the moving parts of the gun. So there's a couple aspects to doing the mechanical parts of the body of the gun that I needed to solve. When I initially tried doing it, I was placing an impactful sound or some sound at the beginning of every single little articulation, and it sounded really robotic and it didn't sound appropriate to the gun. How I ended up solving this problem was I decided to use granular sampling to gain better control of my source and sort of put it in a similar tempo to what was going on with the animations on screen. So here's the servo layer that I used to kind of articulate any of the little hydraulics that I believe would be happening inside the gun. As you can see, it's a Soundmorph Robotic Lifeforms sample, but I didn't have a lot of the source, so it's sort of the same thing, just slightly edited. But the way I created variation is through pitch adjustment over time and wave shaping. So let's give it a quick listen and you can kind of hear what I'm talking about. So I love to find any sort of little way that I can play into a design, and what I used here is this breakdown function in Sitrin 2. If you set it to about 20%, you can pitch it down, but any more than that, it starts to get really sludgy. So I keep it at 20% anytime that the gun is pitching down, so like the little pillars on the back here go into the gun, and then when they come out, I raise the pitch. And it's this sort of articulation that makes it feel, I guess, a bit more alive. Yeah, so being able to play into this design really helped me maximize a limited amount of source. There was other parts of the sample that I could have used, but none of them sounded too close to one another. So this technique really helped. Yeah, M ratio isn't really doing much. I think I just forgot to take it off. And then after that, I have a serum multiband, soothe, another instance of soothe, and per L2. And then to hear how drastic a lot of this process is sort of changing this material, I'm going to play it without any of the processing on. So the mechanical parts that make up the reload aren't that interesting because it's really just reused from the rest of the gun. But what I thought was really cool to show off here is this electrical source that I created. So there's another sample here being used from a robotic lifeforms library, but I'm mixing that with this electrical noise source that I created, and I'm processing both of them together. So there's this weird chain that I made in Snap Heap, and then I'm going to push it into OTT, so that way I can pull up some weird artifacts, and then slam it all down with Devil Lock. So the Snap Heap chain is for cohesion, OTT is to bring out artifacts, and then Devil Lock is to slam it. So now that the gun's been broken down into its individual layers, I wanted to go over some of the source creation that I used to make this design. So this first part here is going over how I made the mechanical bits for the gun. So all the individual parts that were moving as you saw the animation. And what I did was I started to drag in different mechanical bits. This is the one that I landed on. But what I was trying to do is see what fit tonally and match the sort of weight that I thought the gun had on screen. So what I'm going to do quickly is just play through it so you can hear what the original source was. Before I tried to find a way to really gain control of the source, what I remember doing is I sort of just watched the video and I saw which parts of this mechanical source like landed on hits of the gun. So either parts of the gun opening, closing, firing. And I tried to make my markers that way because I thought it would just make the process go a bit faster if something was already on screen that seemed like it matched. I really like this technique because it allowed me to place some markers down and spot the session in a sense. But the thing I thought was really useful is I could kind of see like where I wanted to add specific articulations in the design. The reload was a good example of this. So I got pretty lucky with finding bits that kind of fit the opening and closing, just any sort of articulation that was happening. But I still needed to find a way to take this source that sounded tonally correct, but then change the tempo of the way things would play back to fit with what was happening with the gun's animations. What I ended up doing was using granular sampling, and I adjusted the length and the speed of the sample by throwing it into the granular sampler. And then I figured out a tempo that matched based on what I saw with the animations on screen. So yeah, I thought this sort of technique was really good because it allowed me to get closer to what I was seeing on screen. And it almost felt like I was trying to score something musically, right? Instead of sitting there with a metronome, I'm using the length on a granular sampler to sort of get this source to match up correctly. And just as an example, to showcase what I actually ended up getting as an end result, here's the layer that I ended up doing a bit more processing on afterwards. So yeah, it sounds kind of crazy. And then another thing that I did to add variation, because I was going to layer this source up, was I created like impacts and different bits that would slowly change the pitch over time. So as one bit of the sample would fade out, the pitch would be in a different place from the start of another sample, if that makes sense. So I was trying to avoid any sort of phasing or like buildup of frequencies that could cause a potential issue. So all this material was kind of scattered throughout the design, and then I had bits that I made afterwards that were just impacts based on the original source, so that source didn't go through any granular sampling. I just wanted like hard impacts. So with the body layer, the intent was to use synthesis and then have a very basic patch and kind of listen to the way it would morph in the wavetable position and just see what kind of weird characteristics I could get out of it and think about how I was going to process this to create some sort of body layer. So as is, this layer is sort of interesting, right? It has mid-range, but it's also got movement to it. But one thing that I did was I turned up the unison and I brought down the randomization of the phase, and it kind of opens up this whole new area of like character to the sound. So I normally look at something like this and I go, this is a great basis to start adding different plugins on top rather than just do everything in one patch and see what I can get out of the sound. So you could even add another wavetable if you want to. As a way to kind of think about the sound in the context that I wanted, which was like this impact, I added Traveler and I used this patch here to sort of just start creating impacts for me, and then I threw that through other chains later on. And then once I have the sounds going through Traveler, I'm using L2 to sort of bring up the level and sort of even everything out. And then I'll go and process sound and sculpt it from there. And then the thing is, after I start to slam the signal like this, I wanted to find a way to add back some of the movement because I feel like it was getting pinned. So what I decided to do was use Tremolator and use a very small bit of it. I'll use Gullfoss on individual assets. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I know I'm going to do a lot more processing later. And this is similar to why I would use like Soothe during this process as well. Is I don't want to get bogged down in too much like EQing of an individual sound. I'd rather do that when I'm trying to blend them. And then Recenter's here to sort of shape the stereo image since I added unison. I'm looking back at this, like if you wanted to really analyze the way this chain's set up, the first three plugins are to sort of create a good basis for me to push from. And then the last three are sort of a way to tighten everything up. But everything that happens in the middle between the first three and last three, or however many you'll have, is really just a way for you to experiment without worrying about like clipping or just any sort of weirdness occurring while you work. And so here's Driver, and I think during the creation of this source, I used Driver quite a bit because it has ways to use LFOs and then also like weird envelope filtering and cool stuff with the resonance. And I cycled through the presets here just to see like which bits of material I could get out of this tool. But you can always change this out for any sort of other chain that you want to manipulate audio. Okay, now with Driver. And so yeah, there's no real right or wrong way to go about doing this. You're just trying to find characteristics of a sound that you think sort of fit what you're seeing on screen. So this track is full of a bunch of different material that I generated by experimenting, and I kind of just riffed and jammed on that sort of process for a while until I got something that I wanted. And so yeah, it's just a bunch of experimentation and trying to get different takes out of things. And then what I did here for this next part is I used the granular synthesis idea again, and I used these little bits that I had generated and just threw them into Serum. So that way I'm keeping continuity once again between parts. And I used the length knob in Serum's granular section to sort of adjust the speed. And that's sort of the process behind creating a lot of the textures and the body of the gun. Now we're moving on to the charge sound, and for this I started with a Serum patch. So as you can hear, the charge sound isn't identical, and that's perfectly fine for what I was thinking of using this for. It sort of sustains at the end, but I didn't mind that because I could hard edit it out with like a fade. But yeah, I'm using 3 oscillators. It has unison added to them, the sync is changing, and it's just creating some variation in the sound. So one problem that I came across was before I had this reverb filter on here, the patch sounded fine, but it didn't feel like it fit the space. So to solve this problem, I started to think, well, if this sort of raw source was passing through something, what would that something kind of impart onto it? And so I started thinking about the barrel of the gun and how filtering could help me achieve that sort of timbre that makes it sound sort of metallic. And then over here, I'm using compression to sort of even out the low end and just different areas of the sound. A high pass filter has been added so I can sort of take out a lot of the low end before the shot to make the shot feel bigger. And then tube distortion and more compression was added to sort of flatten out the signal and even it out as low end's been removed. So once I had a patch that I like, I committed this sound to the global sampler and pulled it from there, and then I added these hard edits, so I faded in and out the sound before the shot. So that's how I developed the charge sound. So to show how I did the electrical source, I used Ableton, because that's originally where I did this experiment. The goal is to take a sort of oscillator or something and bring the pitch all the way down to where it's not audible, and then try through compression, saturation, and EQ to bring up some sort of noise or some sort of tone and just see kind of what lies beneath. That was the general concept for this experiment. So right now I have the noise oscillator running, but you can't hear anything. But the second this chain goes on, now you can hear it. I don't think it's too helpful to go over every single plugin in this chain. It's just a series of EQ, distortion, or EQ limiting, and then distortion, and there's no order to it. It's kind of like you just use your ear and then see what you can come up with, but I'm just trying to pull up a lot of the noise from this low frequency sound or whatever, and then see what kind of ear candy I can get out of it. This sort of source material can then be sprinkled across all sorts of different assets. So let's have a quick listen to the source material. So this is Reaper's Media Explorer, and what I did was once I took a lot of this source and I put it through another round of processing, I thought it sounded cooler, and I just saved that. And so a lot of this is how I kind of constructed those electrical bits to the gun. Another way to extend this sort of source material is to take it and then warp it or pitch it up and down. What this will do is also reveal some more artifacts. So that's it for the breakdown of my weaponry design. In the description of the video, I'm going to leave links to showcase some other sound designers who I feel have helped me progress my own capabilities, so make sure to give them a follow. If you have any questions or feedback on the video, please leave it in the comments. I'd love to look and sort of use it to improve the next video that I put out. If you enjoyed the video and would like to see future uploads, please feel free to like and subscribe. Other than that, thank you for watching.